Hello, my friends. Welcome to Keswick Chapel The Chew. This is day 4 of week 19. We're looking at the way of Jesus as the way of consequences, and that is our theological affirmation for today. Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 29 is the passage. This is the parable of the man who built his house upon the rock and the man who built his house upon the sand. And Jesus likened both of them to those who either listen to his words and obey them, and those who do not. So what have we learned? We've learned that the man who builds his house on the foundation, on the solid rock, has a house that will withstand the storms, the rising streams, and the strong winds. And the man who doesn't, well, his house is like a house of cards. A little gentle breeze comes along and blows it down and destroys it. So how are we to apply this to our lives spiritually? Well, let's look at where we've come in Matthew chapter 7 together. We began in verses 1 through 6 talking about judgment, God's judgment, how we learn good judgment, and how this journey, following Jesus' example and following his words, will help us avoid judgmentalism. And then we learned about the way of false prophets, and basically we want to focus on being able to inspect fruit and being able to understand right motives, our right motives firstly, and then someone else's, and then that this leads us to obedience, and that was in verses 15 through 23. And then of course this week in verses 24 through 29 we're talking about the consequences of following Jesus' word or not following Jesus' word. Or, put it another way, the series that we're doing this year is on the way of Jesus, his and ours. So, the way of Jesus versus the way that we would choose to go. So what are the consequences of those? Well, let's look at those. I'm going to give you 7 pros and 7 cons. So what happens when we choose to follow the way of Jesus and we choose to obey his word and put his word into practice? We come to understand God's judgment. Discernment leads us to good judgment. We learn to avoid judgmentalism. Notice I said we learn to avoid it. Didn't say that we would be perfect at it, but we learn to avoid jumping to judgment on other folks. We learn to recognize false prophets because we learn to recognize their motives and their ways. We learn that it's better to choose the narrow path. We learn to listen for the guidance of the Holy Spirit and the voices of others in the church who admonish us, encourage us, and strengthen us in the body of believers in community. And most importantly, we learn to obey God, to cherish our relationship with God, and to live a holiness lifestyle. Again, told you yesterday, holiness is loving God and loving others. We learn these things when we choose to listen to Jesus and obey what he teaches us. Let's look at the other side of the coin. Let's look at what happens when we choose not to listen, much less obey. Isn't it interesting? You really can't obey if you don't listen, right? So these are the things that can happen to us when we fail to do this. We'll never understand God, his judgments, and we'll never understand that he loves us if we never get into his word. We will lack discernment and will lead a life of frustration, confusion, and doubt. We may judge others based on what we see and think we know. We may get drawn into situations that cost us things that we don't even realize it's going to cost us. We'll end up on the wide path, thinking that we're on the narrow path because it's filled with potholes, detours, and roundabouts. But in reality, it's the wide way. It's the broad road that still has the same troubles in it that the narrow path has. The difference is that we won't know how to negotiate these obstacles in our life, and furthermore, we won't realize that we're on the wrong path. We end up mistaking the voice of the enemy, the lies that we hear, for truth. Ultimately, we never obey God because we don't listen and we don't practice what Jesus teaches. Sunday I said that folks are really familiar with something that was said, and I love this phrase because it is true, I promise you. A failure to plan is a plan to fail. So let me ask you, are you willing to choose the way of Jesus? Are you willing to dig into His Word? Are you willing to listen to what Jesus says and then obey His Word? If you are, then you are choosing the way of Jesus. And if you're not, you're choosing your own way. Both ways have consequences. So let me ask you, are you asking the Lord to give you eyes to see and ears to hear His truth from His Word? Are you asking the Holy Spirit to help you to have a receptive heart and mind to His truth that you may grow in His grace? These are the fundamental questions we must ask ourselves each and every day, and often during the day. I pray you'll have a wonderful day, my friends. Go in the peace of God. Blessings to you. Bye for now.